you read some historical accounts and you find out about the perfidious and egregious acts that were wrought on us for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And you think, oh my God, we survived this? We managed to keep our integrity intact. We managed to hold on to our identity, our language, albeit much changed from what it once might have been. We did this because of our extraordinary capacity to survive, which makes me unbelievably proud to be Māori.
Today on Indigenous 100, an Associate Professor and Director of Māori Advancement at AUT University who left school at the age of 15. She's a thought leader and staunch advocate in Māori film, television and media. From Ngātikahu ki Whangaroa, Ngāti Kuri and Te Rārawa, it's Associate Professor Ella Henry on Indigenous 100. Ella Henry, tēnā koe. Associate Professor Ella, Dr. Ella, Dame Ella Henry. Tēnā koe. Not yet. Tēnā koe. Thank you so much for coming on Indigenous 100. Where to begin? Because you've had so much experience, expertise in so many fields of endeavour, and I want to try and break those down a bit, right? But let's begin where you are now, at AUT. When people ask you what you do, how do you respond?
I'm a teacher. And I have been for most of the last 30 years, and I love being in a classroom, particularly a classroom full of young Māori minds, because they remind me that the word ako it's not like learning in the English language. It's ako, akoranga, akonga, all of these words around sharing knowledge. And I always walk into a classroom knowing I'm going to meet people who are smarter than me and more interesting than me, and my job is to help them to connect those parts of their thinking to reach that kind of potential. So I love being a teacher. I'm a researcher, and I've been incredibly fortunate to have a job that is a pleasure to go to every day, that feeds all my passions. I mean, I started work at 15 in 1969 at Crownland Potteries. Because I'd gotten kicked out of school the week before, and my mother said, "You're going to get a job with me at the factory." And I mean, but by some kind of bizarre fate, I've ended up here and not somewhere else entirely differently.
Yeah. Didn't you say, I remember reading something where you said that the factory life wasn't for you, and you went for the factory, or the employees weren't for you either, or something like that.
And I'm not in any way denigrating, because my mum and all my sisters worked at the Crownland Potteries. Right. My dad worked at Astley's Tanneries. I mean, we'd moved to Auckland in 1960 for jobs, and because my older brothers and sisters, Mum and Dad knew if they were ever going to see their mokos, they'd have to move to Auckland. So I got, shoved in the back of the Beverly Hillbillies truck, drove through the Māramatanga Gorge. I didn't know where I was going, woke up in Portage Road in Newlyn, went to school the next day and found out I was brown and poor. Who knew? When you grew up in Ahipara, you just thought the only white person in the village was the principal and his two little white boys in my class. I just thought that was the way New Zealand was. And so found out, along with all the unpleasant epithets that young children can call each other in a dark period in a country's history, you're black, you're Didi Maoris, blah, 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 that I wasn't a princess from Whangatawatia after all.
Okay. But the interesting thing, though, about that period for you also was that it was a different time in New Zealand, right? 1969, 1970, a different New Zealand. And you, pretty quickly, I think, not long after that, you go overseas. Well,
I had a few years. I mean, 69 to 74. I left New Zealand in 1974. So I had 5 years of being the youngest in my family, and all my older brothers and sisters grew up in Karaia and grew up to be good Māori, pregnant at 17, mothers at 18, grandmothers at 36, great-grandmothers at 54. Same with my brothers, and I was the one who got brought up in the city, and in many ways experienced some of the worst of the urban drift and had some of the worst consequences. I mean, I left home when I got kicked out of school and realised I was never going to grow old at Crown and Potteries, and ended up for a while living on the streets during a very dark period in my life. That was when I met James Baxter and ended up going to Jerusalem, which was really an interesting place. The James Baxter, which I know this is a very hard time in his own personal history because of many of the stories that have come out about his life and him in recent years. But he was always very kind to me, and he just grabbed a bunch of us, and we were literally street kids in 1970, all from some kind of brokenness, and he put us on the back of a truck, and we went down to Jerusalem and Hiruharama, and I had an epiphany, I guess. I mean, but it was still part of a longer process. So when in 1974 a friend went off to Australia, and I had fallen in with a very bad crowd, and was engaging in some very self-destructive behaviour. I think that going to Australia at that time was the right thing for me to do, but it wasn't until a few years later, when a couple of very dear friends of mine were murdered by Mr. Asia in 1979, that I realised some very radical changes need to happen in my life. And at that same time, somebody said, I'm going to work on a prawn trawler in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Want to come? And I went, sure, yeah. And that's when I learned at sea what it means for me to be a Māori. Because so many of us have forgotten that we are from a seafaring nation. We've lost our connection to the wairua of the moana, and that for me was, it was a prawn trawler. It was probably the most exploitative fishing you can be doing. But it was also about living on the ocean, which kind of preceded my, sailing for a few years. And it was years later before I realised that's what was my direction and salvation, was living with tangaroa, living at one with the ocean as my ancestors had done for thousands of years. And we've been so, as Māori, disconnected from that part of our identity and our DNA. And that for me was absolutely an extraordinary experience. And when I came home in 1984, I was transformed.
Was it during that time, though, where the realisation was that I've got to go home? Because some people have that experience and don't come home, right? Well, they've stepped, look at the amount of Māori living in Australia now. I
was working on a super yacht, tied up in a place called Antibes in the south of France, sitting in a bar called Le Yacht. I was 29 years old, and I'd just received it, and back in those days when people wrote letters, and my mother hadn't been well, so it had taken 3 months for the letter to find me. And I was sitting in this bar, and I looked around at these 40-year-old, 50-year-old women sitting in the bar, and I thought, I don't think I want that for my future. I think I'm going to go home and look after Mama. Wow. But actually what really happened was I came home and realised I had lots of skills but no education. The great thing about living on a boat for months at a time is everybody leaves books, and I read voraciously, because the alternative was talking to stupid people, and everybody on a boat becomes stupid people except you when you're locked up at sea for a long period of time. So I read voraciously. So I'd come back with no formal education, but I realised that I loved to read and had a voracious appetite.
Where do you think that came from? The appetite to read, to want to learn.
So my mother, it wasn't that my mother left school at 14, school left at 14, because to go beyond that, standard 6, you had to have a horse to ride to Kairaia, to get on another horse to go to Whangaroa, to get on another horse to go to Auckland, to Queen Vic, if you wanted an education past standard 6. So my mother only had that many years of education, but she loved to read as well. And so she taught me to read before I went to school, which unfortunately just made me an uppity Māori at school.
What do you mean by that?
Well, because I knew the words and I knew the letters, and and I didn't fit the stereotype. So I had some uncomfortable years at primary school, because I was one of the kids in the class that knew how to read.
You knew how to read before you went to school?
Yeah, not big, but I knew CAT meant cat and DOG meant dog, and you were supposed to be in Prima 2 before you got to that. You know, so there was a certain amount of antipathy from teachers who did not expect that. I was the first Māori kid at Newland Primary. Me and Rosetta Tui Vaiati, the first Samoan kid at Newland, and her family had also taught, you know, so we were bright, and there were people who didn't like that.
I find your review of your educational experience in Auckland a fascinating thing, because as you say, you were very young when you learnt to read, and you were obviously a voracious reader, and you talked about your mum being a voracious reader, and yet that experience of coming into a new classroom with teachers who had a completely different perspective of where they thought Māori children were at. Now, we are in a different space in society and education system in New Zealand at the moment. However, these have lifelong impacts, and you kind of have the sense of, but for the grace of whatever, that you end up on the other side of the tracks, potentially.
Oh, I mean, I've lived on both sides of the tracks. I know both sides of the tracks. I know which side of the tracks I prefer. But certainly, I did not know that it was unusual to go to school and be able to know your alphabet and know words, and, you know, when they pick up Jack and Jill, to know it. And so I know some of my teachers had a problem matching that with their stereotypical view, because in 1960, we still lived primarily in our tribal homelands, and there weren't very many of us in the cities, and those of us were, I think, that came early probably suffered the worst consequences of that dislocation, but also the absolutely overt racism that wasn't even called that, because, you know, there were pubs that Māori couldn't go into, women couldn't go into pubs, there were barber shops that Māori couldn't go into. We'd accepted that as Māori people as being our lot. And so anyone who remotely challenged those stereotypes was going to be viewed askance, which I think I was too young to know that was happening, but I realised later a lot of my anger.
I was going to say, what were the impacts of that experience?
I was a very grumpy 15-year-old. Yeah, I you know, for a variety of reasons, perhaps the moving to the city and my parents having to work really long hours in factories, and because I was the last on my own, you know, I'd get up at 7 o'clock, make my Weet-Bix, walk to school. And so it was a lonely time, and then to have negative reactions at school about who and what I was. I mean, it's where I learned that humour is a wonderful way of diffusing animosity, and if I could make people laugh, that they would forget about not trusting me or not liking me because I was brown and different. So humour has been my superpower throughout my life, and being short, which doesn't help, you know, because nobody takes you seriously when you never grow past 10.
Where did the humour come from, though? Was that just a naturally kind of evolving thing, or an organic thing, or is that something?
I like to say the only white bit in me is my Irish grandfather. So that contributes to the drunkenness and the humour. I mean, you know, 3/4 Māori and 1/4 Irish, really. It's a joke waiting to be told.
Okay, all right. You also talk about, and I've heard you talk previously also about, when you talk about your overseas experience, and you talked about Tangaroa and that connection that we have. It is a very innate part of leadership, that the balance of, you know, Hoturua Kurd talks about his balanced life being, when I'm on the land for too long, I know I have to go to sea. When I'm on the sea too long, I know I have to go back to land, which is something that is redeveloping, but we lost for a long time.
Absolutely, and the reality is the vast majority of Māori in the 21st century don't own boats. Yeah. And we certainly don't have access to the kind of traditional craft that can take us out into blue water. And I think if anybody were going to do anything, if any iwi in post-development were going to do anything, even if they're inland tribes, it would be around trying to reproduce those experiences for their rangatahi, because there is nothing more empowering than to be at sea and literally feel tangaroa and become one, as your body naturally does as you move over the days, and to go off beyond the land and know that you have to be so attuned to the wind, to the waves, to the heat. You become totally connected in a way that I can do sometimes when I'm in the ngahere. And that's the moment when the true sense of who and what I am and how I'm connected to my ancestors just becomes an absolute reality. And I think that we have still the highest levels of brokenness statistically in terms of all the social indicators. And so much money is put into propping up our disadvantage, and I don't think enough is invested by government or iwi in how we produce alternative ways of being for our people that reconnect us to the real power that we have as a people.
How would you do that?
I would make it obligatory for every Māori young educational experience to incorporate time in the ngahere and time on the moana, because those are the two places where we connect most truly. And for those iwi who still have close relationships with their ngahere, with their moana, and are able to take their rangatahi out, you can see that. You can see that in those young and in those communities and in those marae. It's a flow-on effect. But for the vast majority of Māori, we don't have that experience. We don't have that privilege. There are so many Māori disconnected, not just from our pākainga, but from our DNA. And I would suggest the creation of programs for Māori youth that involve them spending real time in ngahere and real time on moana. And do you know what? I guarantee that would also be good for non-Māori kids as well.
And what do you say to, and this term gets thrown around a lot, iwi leaders, but let's just use that phrase for the sake of this conversation. What do you say to iwi leaders who have the ability, have some resource to be able to start these kind of programs, or at least think about them? What do you say to these iwi leaders who would say in response, that's not our job? There's a thing called the Article 3 line, right? You've heard this before. There's an Article 3 responsibility that the Crown has to all Māori. And therefore it is the Crown's responsibility to look at funding, at resourcing, at planning, at implementing things like this, not ours.
And I think that that's a valid point. However, and I mean this is based on the research I've been doing on Māori leadership for a few years now, but my own personal experiences, I don't think those Māori who have that rangatiratanga imbued in them would even ask those questions, because actually a lot of them are out there at the coalface, already doing it. They may not have the resources to buy a fancy boat or to get the kind of van that can take a group of kids to the ngahere, but they're already doing that where they can. So I don't think I'm suggesting anything that isn't already happening in some very strong, vibrant communities. I mean, you only have to go into the Uraweras or, out on the East Coast or in the far north, and you will already find this kind of thing going on. It's how do we work more collaboratively to develop some kinds of national strategies that make use. We've already got fabulous waka builders in this country. Some of the world's best traditional waka builders live in this country. Why are we not thinking of ways that we can utilise their expertise to develop programs and vessels that can become a norm in every major seaport in the country for not just at-risk Māori youth, but any community that wants to have a real meaningful relationship with their environment. For us, that is all kaitiakitanga is acknowledging our relationship, our literal spiritual connection to land and sea and to each other.
Yeah, and you see the work of Dr. Rangimā Tāmua, Rere Atamākea, well, even Uncle Papahek, right? The work that they've done, Hotu and everyone else, right? There is a real thirst and a hunger, not just for Māori actually, either, non-Māori as well, for mātauranga Māori, for an experience like a waka experience, like going into the ngahere. These things have become, I don't want to say cool, it's a very kind of weird thing to say, but to use a phrase like that, but they are things that non-Māori are wanting to embrace because in a funny way it increases their kind of identity as a New Zealander.
Absolutely. Look, I've been doing some research in the last few years around networking, just the value of networking for Indigenous communities, and one of the findings we've had, because everybody knows your network is your social capital, the value of your social connections, but with Indigenous networks we also found resounding evidence of cultural capital. So when we get together We validate our identity. It uplifts us, whether we're Native American or Aboriginal Australian, Māori, we'll get together and we feel better about being that. But there's another capital that we've also found evidence of, and that's spiritual capital. And for me, that's wairua. And I don't think wairua it's just the Māori word for something that is real, and non-Māori who come from any kind of spiritual vacuum into our world get it. The first time they have that noho marae, where they just don't know the words but they get the feeling. Or the first time they go to a tangi and they really understand why our grieving is so good for them as well as us. Or go to sea with us and have this connection with Tangaroa and the karakia that goes with it. These are universal themes which we are only 180 years and maybe 4 months from losing.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting you talk about that, because you're right, we hear economic capital, sometimes you hear cultural, environmental capital, education capital, but you never hear spiritual capital.
But and when it's used, it's often related to religiosity or a particular particular religious doctrine. And I think for Māori, the true sense of wairua is not just linked to a particular religious doctrine. It is actually about a relationship with one's spirit, and thereby a relationship with one's ancestors, and more importantly, one's unborn descendants. Because we are the meeting place of the two rivers. You know? Yeah. We are literally the connection between our descendants and our ancestors. So we carry that. So there's that. Which is really fabulous when you start to accept that this is part and parcel of who we are and what we have to offer. And increasingly non-Māori are coming into our communities, particularly from other ethnicities that are not European, who are saying, you know, we might have a different way, but we get it. You know, and it's wonderful to get a sense of spiritual connection across language and ethnicity and age and all the other things that separate and divide us, to actually get to the heart of what makes us human.
Yeah. Well, what if we were able to fully actualise your theory on spiritual capital, if we were able to implement it to its greatest effect, what is the greatest change, what is the greatest outcome that would accrue from that?
For me, the chance of connection means you break down artificial barriers between us.
Talk to me about that.
And that to me is the heart of wairua. When you are in a group of people and you all don't know each other and have whatever antipathies you have, and then you have an opportunity to connect at a wairua, a spiritual level. And I'm not trying to sound like a kind of kumbaya chant. No. But we all know, those of us who've experienced it, know that this is an actual phenomenon that a human can experience. And when a group of humans experience it, something miraculous occurs. The divisions between us break down. And we saw a little bit of that in New Zealand after the Christchurch massacre. You know, that we were all so, as a nation, caught up in the horror of this act, that it got us talking about race in a way we hadn't ever. And the same thing, I think, with the COVID pandemic, is that we've had to deal with being isolated and the rules and regulations and protecting ourselves. But in many ways, it freed us to actually spend time looking inwards and thinking about, what do we want that's better for the future? How do we live together and work together better in the future? So I think out of great calamity sometimes comes a stronger spiritual connection.
Yeah, I understand. I guess the other question that comes from that, though, is that Māori would and have said at that time, well, we have had massacres in New Zealand history before. Why now? Why now? Why not other calamities that have occurred recently in our lifetime? Why do you think now the time is right for that change to occur?
A range of technological things. You know, we have access to a global news and social media network which makes information free to everybody. Those massacres that occurred in our history were basically removed from New Zealand knowledge, memory, history. You know, you didn't learn this at school. I didn't learn this at school. This is the last 20 years primarily driven by Māori historians and scholars, where the truth and the treaty settlement process has been absolutely critical to that. You know, I know tribes are always worried about what's the financial redress, but for me, this was true in our tribe, the most important part of the settlement is the historical account. because the Crown has to take responsibility for the truth. And if you ever really want to get depressed, you read some historical accounts and you find out about the perfidious and egregious acts that were wrought on us for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And you think, oh my God, we survived this? We managed to keep our integrity intact. We managed to hold on to our identity, our language, albeit much changed from what it once might have been. We did this because of our extraordinary capacity to survive, which makes me unbelievably proud to be Māori.
I think it's a great point you make, because the benefit of this is not just in terms of our relationship with the Crown or Māori with non-Māori, but have a look at what's happening. Obviously, there's some examples around iwi, particularly one in particular that I whakapapatu and that you're not geographically too distant from. Because we need to know that account for ourselves. Because the spiritual capital that you talk about is also important for our relationship with each other, neighbour to neighbour, whānau to whānau, where there are so many disputes, where there are so many separations, where there are so many barriers that have been put up, potentially through lack of knowledge, but also just around the way that the Crown reacts and interacts with Māori, but also the way in which we choose to interact with ourselves.
And let us be very clear that so much of this antipathy between tribes has really emerged as part of the treaty settlement process, where we have had to configure ourselves into artificial, convenient, clusters to suit the Crown, where we have had to compete against each other over a line in the sand about where my hair finishes and yours starts, and what is the dollar value of that. It has been a bruising and an awful experience, and so many tribes are living with that. The after effects, not just with neighbours, but internally. And so whilst I applaud the devolution of financial and cultural redress to the tribes as a treaty settlement, I think that the bruising has been equally important and negative. And so what I think is desperately needed at the level of iwi leadership is the kind of strategic leadership that understands the nature of collective and collaborative leadership styles. And I just go back to, this was the reality. When you lived in Tāmaki Makaurau in the 1960s, I didn't even know there were other tribes, let alone other tikanga. But what was amazing is, and my parents used to hang out with Hawani, we were Westies. So it was the Hawani Waititis and the Māori Marsdens and the Uncle Simon Snowdens, and all these people from different tribes that formed a community that was so strong and so supportive. And we didn't need any Crown intervention. We just had community leaders who understood collaboration. And the treaty settlement process, the way it's constructed, has been so bruising that unfortunately it's made it easier for leaders to become, the despots of little triangles, just to hold on to what resources and power they've got, rather than being global and strategic. I always remember when I came back from overseas and I had an old auntie who was still left alive, and she had a crusty voice and she talked like that. And people were telling me, why'd you come back? Why'd you go away for? Still being caught up. And I said, I don't know. I was seeing the world. And my auntie took my hand and she said, my darling, the empire ends with you. And that is a really important thought. Too many tribes say you have to be living back in the rohe, you have to be in the kāinga. But if we actually thought of every single member of our tribe as an asset, and made ways for them to contribute, whether they choose to make their life in London or New York or Gold Coast, to see them as assets, not as traitors, then we actually enrich the DNA of the tribe. Because there are literally tens of thousands of Māori out there looking for ways that they can still be of use to their tribe and still get some of that spiritual and cultural capital, but their lives are somewhere else. And that to me takes strategic leadership.
Yeah. I want to talk about another community, Māori media community. you had in my view, the benefit and advantage of engaging with some pantheons and institutions of Māori production, of Māori film, of Māori TV, of Māori content. I think of Don Selwyn, who I had the benefit of engaging with, very limited way, but the benefit of having time with. But you also had Merata Mita and Barry Barclay and others, Ngā Manu Aute. How did you, coming off a prawn trawler, become involved in Māori media and in Ngā Manu Aute?
You only really know you've had a life when you look back on it. You only really know you had a career when you look back on it. When you're living it, life is a series of opportunities and accidents. If I had taken this road, if we hadn't come to Auckland and I'd stayed in Kaitaia, I'd probably have 12 kids and no teeth. Who knows? And I'd probably be a lot happier. So all of the choices we made along. So one of my choices when I came back was to do a course which I am sorry has never survived, and that was the New Start program at Auckland University for mature students. I was 31 years old, I was a solo mother, and I went to university to do this 1.5 of a year course and found out I might be smart. Hey, what I think. And so enrolled at university, and I worked with, I had a job at Student Job Search, and one of the women that I was working with, I went to her family and I met her brother and I fell in love, as you do, and his mother happened to be a very good friend of a bunch of people whom I did not know, but I'd heard a little of. And one day he said, I've got a job, and he had just finished Don Selwyn's He Taonga course. So he was a filmmaker, and which meant he had no money. I at least had a registered car. So one day he asked me to pick up his mum, and I went to this house in Herne Bay, and I went around the corner, and there was this funny white man in the corner of the yard trying to blow up a letterbox, who I found out later was Jeff Murphy and was the man of the house. And it was Merata in Jeff's house, and I said, I'm here to pick up Judy. And Don, it was Barry, said, have you got a pen and paper? And I went, yes, I would go to university.
I'm a student, yeah.
Right there. So I wrote notes, and he said, you're at university? And I said, yes. And he said, that means you've got access to a photocopier. Be very clear, in 1988, a photocopier and a fax was a huge deal. So I left that meeting, taking Judy home, and they said, there's another meeting in a week, you're coming to that? I went, because they were kind of scary. This was.
Don freaked me out. Don't get me wrong.
And but they had something that I didn't realise I wasn't used to experiencing it until I experienced it, and that was strong, bold, smart, sassy Māori. I'd grown up in a community where we might be like that in the village or down at the beach, but around white people it was hats down, eyes down. Put your best cup out. And these were not those Māori. And so university and getting to know these people is sort of woven into the parts of the journey that has become my life. I did not know that at the stage, that it was the start of a whole new journey. But in retrospect, what a gift it was to be able to watch and through Judy, I met Merata and Atareta Pōnanga and Hannah Jackson and I was in my 30s, and these were women in their late 40s who were beautiful, incredibly well-dressed, articulate and scary. Oh my God. And they were just scary to me, little brown girl. They were scary to everybody. And I just thought, when I grow up, can I be like you, please? What a wonderful time to come into some kind of intellectual maturity in that milieu. And ngā hui te awa kōtuku. I mean, these women made a change in the world, and I have an obligation to try in my own way to carry that tradition on,
And that's still what drives you now?
Yeah, it's just the fact that I understand now what lineage means. Yes, I have my own personal whakapapa, but I also belong to a group of generations around making a difference. And what, Barry said once is, every culture sits around the campfire and tells stories. And we've had too long of other people telling our stories and then telling them that is your story. And we deserve authentic authorship. And I've always been driven by his notion, whether it's journalism or storytelling or filmmaking, that if it's not our voice, it's not our story, it's your interpretation of our story. And we are the only people who have the right to tell our story.
I remember going to the launch of Māori television, and a lot of those people didn't come. And I remember sitting there going, what's going on? Why, why not? And I caught up with Don afterwards, and he said to me, well, we didn't, because Don talked about things like that we shouldn't be just put into one box. And there was a real kind of concern, apprehension, anxiety around that was all we were ever going to be, was one Māori television station, Mutuatu, right? And I remember when Ngā Whakaari started, I think you said that Barry was also really worried about all our interests being represented by one rōpū. There was a sense from them was, no, we need to be multiple, that's right, yeah.
Multiple, and I, back in the, after the close down of Aotearoa Television and Te Awhiorangi, the trust that was first created to negotiate with the then national government around what would be the alternative, because we Ngā Whakaari had said very clearly the Aotearoa television service model was fatally flawed because it was based on a competitive model which made the tiny handful of Māori experts competing against each other, and that was reflected really in, I think, many
and they didn't
problems.
Listen. They didn't. And no disrespect to Māori, to Aotearoa Television, I mean they achieved a lot. They got more output than they achieved more output. Yes.
Still, but we did that despite, not because of government controls. And so it fell apart, and the litigants were all lined up ready to take the Māori broadcasting case back to court. It would have been litigious. It was an election year, 1999, and we managed to negotiate a deal for a new television service that would involve a partnership model of governance with Māori and the Crown, a small amount to set up, but ownership of bandwidth, 32 megahertz of bandwidth. This was in 1999. If we owned outright, without management, any kind of management constraints, 32 megahertz of bandwidth now, Māori media would have billionaire status. That's how valuable it is, for a variety of reasons. Then, in December of 1999, National lost the election, Labour won, and we were kind of excited, as you do. And one of the things they did after a few months was cancel that whole thing and start a new process. So the Māori television that came into being in 2004 got more money, which was great, but no spectrum. That was and one of the things I've always worried a little bit about the government intervention is you ask for stuff and you get part of it. But it's what gets not given that hamstrings your original vision for why it would be a good thing. So if Māori television had been set up according to that model where it had the capacity to be more than one channel and we owned bandwidth, it would be financially viable without handouts now, as far as I'm concerned, if that spectrum had been well managed.
And you are obviously a scholar now of Māori media, Māori film, Māori television, Māori production, and my temptation is to say, so how do we fix it? Which is a very heavy question to be able to burden you with, but because there are so many, there are so many disparate views, and as you know, I mean, I was on the review and I went and quite rightfully, I got a bit of a caning from Ngā Whakaari. By the way, most of whom, in fact, all of whom in the room were wahine Māori. Staunch wahine Māori carrying on that legacy, which is great. But it is such a fraught space, and I feel like there are people who have interests and quite rightfully feel they should be protecting those interests. But when we go back to the Barry Barclays and the Meritas and others that we've mentioned, where we shouldn't be so closeted or focused on our one little bit, there is all that entire space that we need to be thinking about. And I think potentially we've forgotten that.
I think yes, to some extent, but also the fact that I too celebrate the extraordinary gains. Yeah. We are unique in the Indigenous world in having an industry that is unashamedly named after us. Yeah. The Māori screen industry is a thing. Yeah. And it has produced over the last 50 years extraordinary films, radio, television, media. The radio stations, I mean, how awesome are they? Keep in mind that and this is why I'm going to make the comparison, iwi radio stations are ground up, or Māori radio stations are ground up. Māori television is government top down. And somewhere between those two is that solution. That I, at the time that Māori television opened, felt that even then, because of the research I was doing then, the heavy investment in bricks and mortar was not necessarily going to carry us well into what is, even in 2004, was evident was going to be a digital future. And I was looking at channels in other countries, particularly like APTN in Canada, that were not built on bricks and mortar, but very small studios that comprised 3 people and some digital equipment, even in 2004. And I thought if we'd spent, instead of the $5 million making that fabulous building, which it was, and I worked in it for 3 years and it was gorgeous, if we'd spent some of that $5 million on satellite, really, truly, the network of media outlets, I think that it would have been a completely different beast. And I looked to the work that Pauline Clegg did in Australia, the Aboriginal filmmaker, who got an SBS and NTV merged or came together, and she got given $1 million budget. And ordinarily people would take that and they'd make a film, or they'd spend $1 million. She instead went out to 50 communities and gave them all an iPad and $5,000 and said, make something. Oh, by the way, here's somebody from your mob that can help you with some of the technical stuff. And they've got hours and hours of rich, extraordinary stuff, some of which will go on to become feature films. That's a different approach. And I think somewhere between that top-down and the bottom-up iwi radios is a model that really truly presents, but that requires organisations that can be representative, that are not competing against each other for a smaller amount of the pot. And the fact that, and I'm concerned that Te Māngai Pāho is a government agency that has, I think, overweening control of how that money is spent. And yes, they do have a board that is, comprised of a wide variety of Māori, and yes, Māori Television does have a board that is Māori and Crown representatives, but I think that, when we first envisaged at Ngāho Whakaari an electoral college, which is he kupupake, but the idea of all iwi, like Mātāwai now, being able to have a say in how that money is distributed, what the criteria are, really important things like what is the kaupapa of the production company? So that you don't have non-Māori production companies hiring a Māori producer or a Māori writer and tapping into that Māori funding and making a story, whilst the overarching editorial control is still outside of our hands.
You are talking, it's not just relevant to the broadcasting sector either, and you are a political commentator. You've talked on other panels about this kind of notion around take, for example, a very live example at the moment around Māori restaurants with a Māori name, and not having any Māori cuisine, not having any other kaupapa Māori or anything like that as a part of the organisation, but just simply have a Māori name, intellectual property rights issues, or all that kind of thing. So I guess the point of the question that I'm trying to ask is, because this is what you do, it's not fusing, but the use of, how do you align kaupapa Māori with content development, with business organisations, particularly those in the broadcasting sector? How do you do that so you have this very clear, visible, tangible way of saying, kaupapa Māori, it's Māori content. We're therefore going to fund and ensure that we can build and sustain the production sector as a result of having very clear kind of guidelines around that.
So what's guided my own research as a Māori academic researcher has been a really exciting, I think, part of the evolution of what is a kaupapa Māori research. Because you could apply these same principles to what is a kaupapa Māori production and what is a kaupapa Māori business. And so over the years I've tried to synthesise the great thinkers amongst our writers and distill something that can work for me as a set of what I call principles, but they're also just questions, and there's just 3 of them. But if I can answer them as honestly as possible, then I know that I'm on the kaupapa. Right. And the first one is that it is by, with and for Māori, unless we say otherwise. If we invite non-Māori in, that's fine, but we're doing the inviting. Yeah. We are not being brought in as a colour consultant. Okay. By, with and for Māori validates te reo me ngā tikanga Māori and delivers positive outcomes for Māori. You apply those 3 principles to anything and you will be able to discover its kaupapa. Mm-hmm. Just simple little things like pronunciation of our words, and I tip my hat to those broadcasters who've taken the time to learn enough about the reo and the mita that when I hear them on the radio I don't go, ow. And then I hear the others and I know that what they're doing is not validating te reo me ngā tikanga Māori. And that's a simple enough and easy measure. And then particularly for research and for business and for film production, that you create something that contributes, that you can say hand on heart, this is, and even a film like Waru, which had 8 Māori producers and told a dark and terrible story, was ultimately about hope, ultimately about shining a light in a dark corner. I mean, even even Once Were Warriors, did the same thing. That there were critics of it even from within the Māori world, but at the end of the day, if we don't shine the light into that dark corner, how can we expect to fix it ourselves? And therefore, we just, wait around for some white saviour to save us? No, I think we have that capacity. Yes, it should be funded as a set of strategies by government as part of, the treaty, but we also have to put the self into self-determination. We all have an obligation to heal ourselves and to give out what aroha we can in our communities that are going to really deliver meaningful change.
What I love about that, I'll call it a framework, what I love about it is that it can apply to many different things, not just broadcasting, right? Māori business, Māori development, those kinds of things. The other thing I wonder is, it is a competitive advantage now in the society that we live in, and you having the benefit of spending so long overseas in your younger life would have seen a change in our society now, where things Māori have become, the cool thing to be doing now. And I wonder actually how you deal with that, because it's completely different when you left in 1974.
There is a thing that's happening in the West, and I call it the West like it's a thing, but it is to some degree a demarcation of the planet. What is really the hegemony of Eurocentric thinking, if you're going to go down that route, which is, the power of European imperial views that shape so much of what we think is right and correct and good, but there are also challenges in that great Western behemoth, because many white people are also finding that they're living in a cultural vacuum. And in the 60s, they went off to India and smoked joints and learned to play the sitar. In the 70s, they became punks and stuck pins in their noses. In the 80s, they grew their hair really long and had... So there's a yearning, even outside of the Māori world. And the thing is, unfortunately and fortunately, Indigenous people have fallen into a little slot of being the trendy solution of the decade. And so you have an inordinate amount of cultural appropriation occurring, where, for example, recently there was a German bloke that I was interviewed about. I did not know. He had been watching the haka on YouTube and had started a company teaching haka as a corporate and was charging a lot of money. It was either Dutch or German. Was utterly unembarrassed when Radio New Zealand got a hold of him and said, "You do realise this is cultural appropriation?" He said, "I don't care." So there's nothing we can do about that level of appropriation. What I applaud is those people who come into our world and understand that they are visitors in it and they treat respectfully of it and they utilise the language with integrity. And I think of a number of, Pākehā journalists in the country at the moment and other people who Ming Foon, from the ex-mayor of Gisborne, who have understood that a meaningful relationship with Māori is going to be predicated on a respect for and understanding of our language and our culture. And that has enhanced their lives and ours. That's the kind of magic zone we want to be in, rather than the appropriators who think they can, pitch tents on Ōwairaka Maunga and do a karanga. And who don't actually get how wrong that is and how damaging that may well be to their own psyche. Because this is spirit work, this is wairua work. And if you do that with integrity, it will feed you and fill you. It will provide you with all the soul food you need to survive the worst challenges. But you mess with it, and I'm convinced it does psychic spiritual damage. And that's about as flaky as I'm going to get today.
What keeps you up at night? What worries you? Because you're quite a positive person, and I think that's because of the way that you can ingratiate yourself with your students, the way that you're able to, because you can see tangible benefit, well, not tangible benefits, but you can see that the work that you are doing is having a massive impact on people who will go on and become and have very fruitful lives and go into fields of endeavour that will help lead the country going forward and that kind of thing. But there probably are some things that you worry about and keep you up at night, and I wonder what those are.
I think this is really the biggest problem facing humanity at the moment, and perhaps forever, and that is the fact that we are destroying Papatūānuku. She is in pain. We, as a species, not us necessarily here in this country, are destroying the rainforests that are the lungs of the planet. We are spoiling the oceans with the detritus of human society. In my lifetime, we may see the water temperature rise another 2 degrees centigrade. If that happens, sea levels will rise 10 metres. Half of this country will disappear. I say to my daughters, buy high. But the reality is, they're all scared to have babies. So whilst we can do all of the soul work that we need to become a better human being, we have to become a better species. And that means empowering our young more to follow Greta Thunberg and strike for the environment, adopting whatever singular at-home practices we can. It's tiny here in Ahakoa he iti, but I am really scared for the planet, and that keeps me awake at night.
How do you have that conversation with Māori communities, right? There are many of our marae coastal, right? Not so much an issue for us in Totoro. It's one beach 2 hours that way and another 1 hour and 45 minutes that way. Prime property in 2 generations' time. But how do you have that conversation with so many Māori communities who are very much coastal communities, mahinga kai in the sea? We're having these conversations now, but how fast are these conversations, and actually how fast is the work that's required to give effect to those conversations going to have to happen?
So much of this may be outside of the hands of those of us who are alive now, but I know that you can publish academic papers which are almost unreadable, you can, talk on television and radio, but the reality is what Māori like is kanohi ki te kanohi. So I try to have as many conversations as I can at home. I try and work with as many individuals I know at home who are making a difference. I mean, I have a cousin in his 70s whose house is completely solar, off the grid, because we have nothing in the bay. No road, no electricity, no water. you know, and he has been since he was 60, and he saw the writing on the wall 15 years ago, completely off the grid. I've got a niece, you know, who runs Mahi and Kaimara programs. So you have to work one person at a time to really make a difference in our communities. But the bottom line, and this is what really keeps me awake, is we are already halfway there to understanding the true value of loving our mother, the earth, and caring for her. What worries me is the other 7 billion on the planet who don't. So the reason why I try to be as vocal as I can and publish as much as I can in as wide a variety of outlets is because I want other Indigenous peoples around the world to connect with us and to become part of the sort of networks that allow us to have a say locally and globally, because I genuinely believe that Indigenous thinking has answers. And I genuinely believe when political leadership is prepared to listen to what we have to say, that we can come up with solutions, but the window is small.
What has caused this? What led you there? Given your career, your academic, and I know you're an academic, and so therefore it maybe has very much a part of its life with you in terms of what you do as a day job, but what was the moment that sparked this concern?
I go back to the time I spent working on the ocean, to being a period in my life, and it was from 26 to 30. You know, it's only a small window of my total life, but the ability to live on the sea gave me such an insight into how small I am, how big it is, but how when the ability to connect with us, with the ocean and the sky, gives you such a sense of immortality. That's the wrong word, but you know, such a sense of fusion, a sense of connection with the environment that I think was a normal part of being Māori in a very early pre-contact culture, where, you know, you look at wānanga, you look at hui, you look at all of the old tikanga that we used to get together when wānanga was a verb and not a noun. You know, it was a thing we did. When runanga was a thing we did. When whakamininga was a thing we did. And all of those things, all of that tikanga was about connection. And when you are really connected, then you understand how important your environment is, how important your whānau is. Now, I know as well as you do that there were times that we went to war and battled and raged against each other. So we did not live in some kind of idealised paradise, but we had some cultural values and practices that were really also about trying to figure out how to make peace. And you know, if you really look at pre-European warfare, it generally involved half a dozen boys and sticks until one of them died or got injured. And then, you know, there would be some kind of, you know, utu, usually involving a pretty young girl and a virile young man coming together and creating a new tribe. I mean, you know, it only became really the introduction of the poo, the musket, is what took our warfare from essentially border skirmishes to a terrible period in our history. One which I hope we've learned from, but sometimes on a bad day, if I squint, I think maybe not so much. It's just that we have different kinds of muskets now.
Yeah, I understand.
I'm not sure that I answered your question.
No, I think you did. To come back then to a little bit about what we talked before, because as I say, I get a massive sense of positivity from you when I talk to you. And you are able to give clarity to certain aspects and issues that we deal with, that I'm interested in, that help me kind of think about, this is a way of being able to deal with some of those issues that we talked about. Where does that come from? Where does that evolve from? Because you've had some dark periods in your life too. You mentioned a couple of them earlier. Even in your employment career, you also had a dark period. I won't go too much into that. So where does this the spring of kind of positivity, maybe it's divined a pathway forward, so you just keep moving forward? I'm not sure, but where does that come from?
I'd like to think that its scientific term is growing up. And I say that blithely, but the reality is, you know, I spent a lot of the first 30 years of my life angry. and unhappy because I felt aggrieved about so many things. And then I spent, maybe 10 years in my first years as a scholar learning about my true history as a Maori and as a woman, and I got angrier. And then I started to meet a bunch of other angry 40-somethings, and I thought to myself, is this going to be the shape of the rest of my life? Because I do know angry 60-somethings, I'm a 60-something now, who will never be able to bridge some of the gaps that they see in their world, because there's still so much rage in them, and I came to this place, in my late 40s, early 50s, so that's 15 years ago, where I thought I could waste the rest of my life just hating things, or I could try to figure out how to contribute to making things that make me happy. And I do think parenting had something to do with that. That was a great privilege. I was very late to parenting. I mean, I had my first child at 30, and my last at 40. So late bloomer. Take my baby to kohanga, and they say, "Oh, is that your moko?" You know what I mean? That thing. But one of the things about becoming a parent later is it made me really, really appreciate what a gift it is. They don't call it a whare tangata for nothing. It's a sacred house. And to be able to have the gift of being able to create life and then watch that life grow and become a healthy, strong, person is just, if that can't turn you into an optimist, then quite frankly, you're a lost cause.
Associate Professor, Doctor, Dame Ella Henry. No. Ella Henry, thank you very much for coming on Indigenous 100. Thank you very much for being a part of this program. And we wish you all the best in your future fields of endeavour. Te Rārawa.
Kia ora, ngā mihi.